Economists for Full Employment, Global Labor University, and the Gender and Macroeconomics Working Group. Her publications include The Effects of International Trade on Gender Inequality in Iran, The Effects of Afghan Immigrants on the Iranian Labor Market, The Role of Credit in Women's Employment, The Case of Women's Cooperatives in Iran, and Iran's labor market under the sanction. Dr. Karimi, we are eager to hear your insight. The mic is yours. Thank you.
Okay. 15 minutes sharp, is it? Okay. I am really happy that I am in this very interesting conference. Most speakers are social, political scientists, and I am economist, something a little different. So you can see the title of my presentation is The Impact of Iran's Orientation Towards the East on the Economic Performance. So you say that this foreign policy is excellent. The other one said this foreign policy is failed. What is the criteria to be for comparing foreign policy? I am an economist, and I look at economic variables and indexes. Okay. My presentation will be in two main parts and then to conclusion. The first part is economic development and foreign relation. It is theoretical debate. What is the relation between foreign policy and economic performance? And then I will go to Islamic Republic of Iran, foreign policy, and its impact on different economic area, for example, labor market and technology transfer, and then I will conclude. For the first part, when I listened to the speakers from different parts of university of the world, unfortunately, there is not many discussion about the impact of foreign relation on economic performance. But really, foreign relations have very close connection with economic performance, as trade is very important. There is a very famous economist, Robert Solow, a Nobel laureate. It says that trade is the engine of development for developing countries. When there is not trade, it means that any developing countries must invent the wheel from the beginning. But when there is trade relationship between developed, advanced countries with developing countries, they can transfer technology, they can learn, and it is the big example of China, Korea, that with opening the door, they could transfer the technology and started a very rapid economic growth. So trade is very important, and foreign relation is very important for trade. When there is hostility between two neighboring countries or a country that is very important for other countries, this hostility stop trade. And if there is some attempts to continue the trade, informally will be harsh punishment. So having good political relation is the precondition for the trade. So because of this interconnection between economic performance and foreign policy, there is a very important part of international relation that is economic diplomacy. So what is the impact of this diplomacy and economic of any country? So nowadays, there are a lot of discussion about this economic diplomacy, and many economists also insist that foreign policy is a complementary to economic policies. You cannot have some economic policy and without any notice to this economic plan, development plans, you put aside another foreign policy that hinder economic development. And it is very important to consider the costs and benefits of this foreign policy for economic performance. So it is my idea that foreign policy must serve to economic performance of a country because the people wants to be in better situation by going on long times and looking back, they can understand that they are growing. They are in better situation, especially when they compare themselves with neighboring countries, with other countries. If the economic performance is very bad and tolerate a lot of negative impact of foreign policy, how we can assess this foreign policy is successful. So for me as an economist, I must notice economic performance. Okay, now I will go to Islamic Republic of Iran's foreign policy. Before Islamic Revolution, United States and Germany was the biggest trade partner of Iran. But after Islamic Revolution, these policies changed a lot, and referring to Iran constitutions after the revolutions, there are very important rules for foreign policy. For example, connection with the people, not especially the government. So you must have connection with the people, suppress people. And especially regarding Israel-Palestinian problems, we must support Palestinian groups, especially Islamic Palestinian group. And because of long history, perhaps, of Iran, we started a hostility with the U.S. and its ally after the revolution. And the problem is that Iran, as a developing countries and oil exporting countries, must have good relation with the West and advanced countries. But this foreign policy had this just opposite side of economic performance and had negative impacts. I must mention that this foreign policy during these 44 years was not so monotonic and equal all the time. We had some period that reformist government, moderate government, or pragmatist government of Mr. Rafsanjani, Hashemi Rafsanjani, they tried, because after the Iran-Iraq war, the economy was in very bad situation, and they wanted to change the opportunity like China, have better relation with the West, and try to transfer technology and everything. But after some years, again, these hardliners changed the government, and again, looking at the East, confronting with the West, again came to the foreign policy. Especially during Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, when Iran's oil revenue was very high, perhaps they decided to have better relation with the East, because Iranian government believed that the world needs the oil, so we can play as we want. So again, this hostility increased during Ahmadinejad. And another problem since the early 2010s, perhaps, was this nuclear energy problem that started a new negotiation between Iran and 5+1, as you know. But during Ahmadinejad, this tension increased, and after stopping this negotiation, hard sanctions against Iran started. But as Iranian people were really dissatisfied with these sanctions and high inflation because of this sanction, declining oil revenues, the new presidential election was like referendum that people voted for what they say, moderate government to solve the problem, to open up the country again. And by this new government, this nuclear tax get better condition. And in 2016, this JCPOA agreement was signed, and unfortunately we had some problem in Iran, and also after Trump presidency, again this problem increased, and we again became under very hard sanctions, and Iranian people tolerated a lot of pressure. I have no time. I want to show you what is the impact of looking at East. You can see here trade partner of Iran. UAE is not a country of East, really. It's a route for Iran to have connection with the West, not the East. So Iran trade with the UAE, a small country, is indirect import and export with the West. So you can see here, I don't know whether you can follow. I put 2001 and 2022. You can see UAE has very important percentage of trade of Iran, 30%. But regarding China, in 2001, China's share of Iranian trade was 5%. And after the sanction, it increased, and in 2022, it is 26%. And if you go to Germany, you can see in 2001, that was the period that Iran wanted to have more trade with the West, it was 10%, and now is 22 was 3%. And if you go to Switzerland, France, South Korea, and Italy, Japan, all are near zero. So you can see India also is not so high, because India also follow what US insists on. And many projects with India also stopped. Regarding China also, China is very careful, and many big Chinese companies do not wants to have trade with Iran because they prefer to be in US markets. So if you want to see what is the effect of this East orientation, perhaps you can see after 2011, we have the problem of declining investment. And regarding labor market, we have this increase in employment a little in 2020-21, but you can see that labor productivity is declining very rapidly, and it means that stable, high value-added jobs is disappearing, and the people go to self-employment, you know, and the situation gets worse. I have no time. And if you look at another criteria for labor market, you can see that minimum wage in nominal term is increasing, but because of high inflation, the wages of Iranian is declining really, and the people can see that their standard of living is declining. And we have a lot of problem in technology transfer. I can tell you regarding medical instruments. You know, we have a lot of medical instruments from Western country, and we cannot transfer new hardware, software for calibrating them, and we had a lot of problem in Iranian hospitals, let alone factories. So I go to my conclusion, the last one. I believe Iran needs to have balanced relation with the East and the West, as other countries have the same balanced relation. Go to Turkey, go to China. All countries try to have balanced relation with the East and the West. And I believe, as an economist, the precondition for economic better situation of Iran, economic development for Iran, is lifting sanctions and having balanced relation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Karimi, for setting the stage with an interesting, insightful presentation. Now, allow me to introduce our second speaker, Professor Karim Eslamloueyan. Karim Eslamloueyan is a professor of economics at Shiraz University, Iran. He received his PhD in economics from Ottawa University, Canada. His research interests include macroeconomics, international economics, and Islamic economics. Eslamloueyan mainly focuses on energy-rich countries and Middle East and Asian economies. He has published 70 research articles in peer-reviewed journals such as Energy Policy, Economic Modeling, Emerging Market Finance and Trade, Economic Analysis and Policy, and China Economic Review. Eslamloueyan has published a book on advanced macroeconomics with an Islamic perspective, 17 books, chapter, and conference papers. Professor Eslamloueyan, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. First, I would like to thank Arab Center, the Iranian Studies Unit, Professor Kamrava and Hamide and Mu'taz for their support and organizing this conference and meeting. The title of my paper is The Effects of Sanctions, Complexity, and World Trade Uncertainty on the Trade Relationship between Iran and major Asian countries. The structure of this paper is after introduction and researcher review that I will not talk more about those things. We talk about Iran's trade ties with West and East. We will see the figures and discuss about this. Then, you see, as economists, we have to verify if there is a relationship and there is an impact, so we need a model. And if there is, we have to prove that there is impact. We don't say that there is impact. So we need a model to verify that. So we make usually a statistical and mathematical model. We test the model, and we say, okay, this is, the model is verified. Okay, when it is verified, we say there is an impact. Sanction has impact. Then the next question is how much? How it will affect this, okay? If, for example, this variable changes by 1%, how much it affects the Iran's trade with West? Does it increase it or decreases or increases the effect of Iran trade, on Iran trade with West? So we made a model. I don't go through the model. The model is in the paper, and I put it in the appendix in the case if somebody is interested. Is mathematical, statistical model. Those who are familiar in here is autoregressive distributed lag models, and I will not go through the model. Then I talk about data and methodology. Then we test the model to see if there is an effect, and if there is, how much is the effect, and then conclusion. This is the structure of this paper. Let's put aside this introduction because our time is very limited. The question that I would like to answer, and based on this question, I have constructed 5 hypotheses. I read the question, then I want to answer this question by using the model that we built, okay? Has Asia's share in Iran's total trade increased over time? This is a real question. So everybody said Iran's look policy or look east policy. But the question is, what has happened during 50, 60 years ago? Okay, I will show you the figure and then we test it, okay? What is the role of harsh economic sanctions imposed on Iran in shaping Iran-Asia trade ties? We will answer this question. Does world trade uncertainty contributes to Iran's trade look toward the east? Does improving Iran's economic complexity affect Asian trade with Iran? I will explain what is complexity, what is uncertainty, a little bit I will explain. And finally, we were also interested to see what was the effect of COVID-19 crisis on shaping Iran's trade with South and East Asia, during 2-3 last period, okay? These are the hypotheses, okay? There is no, we search for it. There is a lack of literature on this issue on Iran's trade, and nobody has, as far as we know, studied the effect of these variables on Iran's ties with East. By East, we mean South and East Asia. We considered 15 countries. I will show you the name, like Japan, India, China, South Korea, Iran main partners, Malaysia, Indonesia, and other countries. And we collected data for about 28 years. And then we estimated the model, okay? The purpose was to quantify the effect, okay? How much, okay? Not just say there is effect, okay? So before I explain the results, let me show you something. It is interesting. This is Iran's trade percentage of GDP. From 1960 to 2020, 60 years. And before revolution, Islamic revolution, and after Islamic revolution. You see, let me explain is when I say trade as a percentage of GDP, GDP is gross national product. It means the degree of openness. When they want to measure the degree of openness, any country, they say how much trade this country has with the world. For example, we add export, the value of export plus imports, and divided it by GDP of a country. So Iran was very open. You see, as the figure shows, in 1970 to 1973, the share, this openness index was about 80%, is very high. For you to know the degree of openness, you see the US economy, the degree of openness for US economy, United States is 15%. United States is almost a closed economy because they rely on themselves, okay? So everybody thinks, although it has a lot of share towards trade, in the second largest economy in terms of trade, but it is only 15%. But Iran was 80%, okay? So it was very open. The 80% means in 1972 and 1973, there is a first oil shock. The price of oil tripled, okay? And Iran's revenue from exporting oil was huge. So it went to that point. But after that oil shock, it came down to about 40%. And after revolution, Iran-Iraq war, it went down to less than 20%, from 80% to less than 20%. And then it fluctuated during times, okay? For example, when there was a sanction, President Obama sanction, it comes down, and then the sanction is relief, it goes up. Again, when then President Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, again it comes down, and it fluctuates based on economic factors and political factors. This is Iran's trade with the West. This figure shows Iran trade. You see, during the time, for example, it has reached to about 40%. 0.4 is 40%, okay? It was about 1990. It was not very far. It was Iran, the share of Western countries in Iran total trade. And it starts coming down, and it reaches to less than 10%. You see what has happened. And everything has contributed to this decline and this downward sloping trend. We should test it, okay? These are facts. And this is Iran's trade with South and East Asia. It's increasing, upward sloping. And to see how the gap between West and East in Iran's trade is widening, I refer you to this figure. See, this red line is the share of Asia, South and East Asia in Iran's total trade, and the blue line is the share of Western countries in Iran total trade. So you see at about 1999 or 2000, they cross each other, and then the gap will start widening, okay? So it's a fact, but still we have to test it, okay? We see it, okay? We have to see the effect. Why? Okay. So another figure, I have 5 minutes left. This figure shows that Iran's look toward East is not confined to Iran. This is a world trend. This shows that the share of East or emerging Asian countries in Middle East countries is increasing. So it's a general trend. I will explain it a little bit later because I don't have time. Anyway, there is a general trend that Middle East, not only Iran, are looking toward East in terms of trade with East, okay? So then we made a model, we test the model, and then we drive the result. The result shows, after verifying the model, that economic sanctions has negatively affected the trade of Iran, and it harms really the trade. We know how much it is. It's very significant, and we cannot ignore it. So there is the effect, and this effect is very significant. We have the result, the numbers, okay? Complexity. What is complexity? Complexity index is recently developed by some countries, okay? Complexity shows how knowledge is embedded in the commodity that you produce and export. So when the complexity index is high, it means that this economy is knowledge-based economy, okay? It has diversification, and the technology is very high as knowledge intensity in the production, resource allocation, and distribution is high. We test this. We thought that complexity, because complexity in East Asia is much more than Iran. How does Iran's complexity contribute to Iran's look west? It is positive or it is negative? Another thing that is very important is uncertainty. World trade uncertainty. In uncertain environment world, we expect the trend of trade changes. How uncertainty in trade, or they call it world trade uncertainty. There is an index. It is measured by some institutions. We have used those indexes to see how it affects this trend. We also had economic growth in Asia, COVID as a control variable. I don't spend time because I don't have time to explain those things. We tested this hypothesis, and our model allowed us to estimate the coefficient of these variables or factors, and we did it for our sample covers 15 Iranian main partners in the East, and it covers from 1995 to 2020. The result shows that economic sanction was a primary determinant of Asian share Iran's trade with the world. It is proved, okay? And also it showed that the complexity is important. Iran's specific complexity index, when it is higher, the lower is Asian share in Iran's trade. Why it is lower? Because the complexity index in China is 25, in Iran is 62, and in Japan is much more higher than that. So when Iran is, the complexity index increases, it means the knowledge-based commodities are more produced in Iran, but Iran cannot export them to East Asia, export to less developed Asian countries or the neighboring countries. And World Trade Uncertainty Index shows when uncertainty in the world increases, Iran's trade with East increases, okay? And finally, the COVID-19 has negative effect. The growth rate in South Asia increases the share of East in Iran's total trade. The conclusion. I want to conclude different economic and political factors affect Iran's move toward Asian countries. Among these factors are economic sanctions imposed on Iran, and also Western or world trade uncertainty and complexity. Let me go to the final point, last slide. Comparing the trade connection between Iran and the East with the decreasing trade relationship with the West, we conclude that Iran's move toward the East is not necessarily a strategic choice, but it is a necessity that dictates its will, okay? It's not our choice. We had to do this. The hostility between Iran and the West and the harsh economic and non-economic sanctions imposed on Iran by the West have left no choice for Iran but to boost its economic relationship with the East. However, they are not the only driving force contributing to the rise of Iran-East trade policy. This is very important. While it is very important, but it is not the only driving force. There are other factors that are important as well. The challenge in global trade movement towards Asia is also essential, okay? Because we checked the evidence we put in the paper that many Middle Eastern countries with no hostility of conflict with the West have also increased their trade with the East. For example, the share of trade between Middle East and North African countries such as Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt with Asia has risen during the last 30 years. So it's not just confined with Iran. And Iran-West conflict embedded in economic sanctions, so only a speed of Iran's move toward the East, but it is not the only driving force for Iran's look East policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Eslamloueyan, for sharing your valuable insights. Now, please join me to welcome our third speaker, Dr. Cyrus Ashayeri. Cyrus Ashayeri is a principal technologist at Beyond Limits. Ashayeri holds a PhD in petroleum engineering from University of Southern California. His professional career includes engineering projects at the National Iranian Oil Company and energy security projects in Washington, D.C. Aside from his technical work, Ashayeri has a number of publications on policy and environmental aspects of energy sectors. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. The paper is titled, How Can Iran Learn from Sustainable Energy Initiatives in ASEAN? What we'll look at in the next 15 minutes is a high-level overview of Iran's energy security landscape and what ASEAN's energy landscape and also their climate response looks like. Why this paper discusses that looking into Southeast Asian countries might have a better model to offer to Iran to improve its energy security. And we look at lessons learned from 4 countries, Vietnam, Thailand, Singapore, and Malaysia, that Iran can replicate. So, as we know, Iran holds the highest combined oil and natural gas reserves in the world. But in the meantime, the country has failed and in putting efforts into increasing its renewable capacity or diversifying its energy. And Iran has a very inefficient pattern of energy consumption and currently ranks 9th in the world in terms of energy consumption. Some of the challenges that Iran is facing is Iran has literally no natural gas export facility, and for petroleum export is facing a lot of political barriers. Iran is facing seasonal shortage of natural gas, and the refinery fleet in Iran is outdated. Iran has compromised fuel quality issues. And the power plant generation has inherent issues, old power plants, and a lot of power loss in the power electricity distribution grid. All of these have resulted in Iran's deviation from its old petroleum exporting image and status, and Iran might be on a trajectory to become a net importer of energy in the near future. All of this means that Iran has to face a new reality and maybe revise its energy policy to mitigate risk. On a global scale, Iran's energy policy is posing serious climate risk on a global scale. This data from World Resources Institute, the chart shows that Iran's per capita GHG emissions ranks fourth in the world. Iran's per capita emissions is higher than countries like China, Japan, or the EU. Iran's commitment to climate change has been labeled as critically insufficient by international organizations, among a handful of countries that have not signed the Paris Agreement for climate change. And the continuation of the current energy practices will pose serious climate risk on a global scale, which means that the international community might need to revise its policy towards Iran to mitigate risk on a global scale. Now you look into Southeast Asian and ASEAN countries, and these countries are not heavyweights when you start thinking about a Look East policy, but altogether they have the third largest population in the world and the fourth largest energy consumption in the world. They're showing steady and considerable economic growth, population, and energy demand growth. They're also showing practical commitment to carbon reduction policies. They've been improving their energy security, electrification, access to clean energy, and continue to invest in renewables. They also have decades of experience in regional collaborative frameworks similar to APAC framework, and they also engage with a large group of international countries to improve their energy security. And finally, they have attracted financial, policy, technology, and education support from a very diverse group of international community countries and organizations with usually different geopolitical objectives. So we discussed why the ASEAN model might actually be a better or a more preferred model for Iran to replicate. First of all, these heavyweight countries like China, India, and Russia do potentially offer instructive examples in certain aspects. These group of countries, and even OECD and Western countries, however, may not serve as entirely practical models for Iran at this stage. These countries benefit from a superpower status, they're technology leaders, and they have a global reach to access resources and finance. However, Iran shares some challenges with ASEAN. Iran relies on a single source of energy, mainly natural gas, and a lot of ASEAN countries rely on coal. A lot of the countries in that region have experienced transitioning from a net exporter of energy to a net importer. Iran, also similar to ASEAN, has potential to become a regional energy hub. And also both sides rely heavily on energy subsidies, and they have unhealthy or uncertain regulatory environment when it comes to energy policy. Iran faces unique challenges, and it's a lot of are similar to what ASEAN is experiencing or has experienced in the past. And ASEAN offers a more realistic use case with more structural similarities and limitations when it comes to resources and technology. So we're looking at 4 use cases in this paper, and these are energy or climate-related problems that ASEAN countries have achieved world-class solutions in the past. And these initiatives are closely relevant to current energy security and environmental risks associated with Iran, and these models can yield medium or short-term rewards for Iran. We look at Vietnam for improving its solar energy capacity, Thailand for improving its energy efficiency, Singapore for smart city models, and Malaysia with a focus on national oil companies in Petronas. So Thailand, Vietnam, as you see here, out of nowhere in less than 3 years, becomes among the top 10 solar power capacity holders in the world. And in comparison, India, it took them more than 10 years to improve their rank and become a top 10 country. Vietnam is a very interesting use case because in 2010 to 2021, they had the highest electricity demand growth in the world, 125%, as opposed to the world average in this time period around 31%. They followed through with a high commitment to a comprehensive legal framework and executed in a very professional way. They devised feed-in tariffs that was very attractive and helped them to attract a lot of investment to a point that it actually became too successful. And today, Vietnam has more solar capacity that its power grid can ingest, which means that there's need for parallel infrastructure development for export maybe. However, in case of Iran, because there's a water crisis, Iran will probably not have this issue if they develop distributed solar systems can be coupled with water desalination and can help Iran. In the paper, there's a very elaborate table. I've recreated this basic visualization that shows there are only a handful of government offices and maybe universities involved in Vietnam for this end-to-end process. They devised the policy, devised the feed-in tariff rates, and designed the infrastructure, followed through with continuous recalibration and being able to execute this in a very short period of time, which can be easily copied by Iran or many other developing economies. Next case is Thailand and their energy efficiency efforts. So Thailand offers a lot of practical, cost-effective energy efficiency measures which are adaptable to Iran and same countries. Thailand's very aligned with ASEAN's initiatives like their ISO standards or the fuel economy roadmap. And they're on their path to reduce their energy intensity by 30% and increase the share of renewables in their energy mix by 30% within the next 14, 15 years. Here's a breakdown of their planned renewable energy capacity, with solar being the biggest market share. And to put this in context, Bushehr's nuclear reactor, with all the fanfare around it, only produces 1 gigawatt of electricity capacity. These are some of the elements that have helped Thailand to be successful in achieving very good energy efficiency standards. They have high energy performance labels, technologies for motors in both residential and commercial sector. Their EV tax incentives and fuel standards have been really successful. They have a nationwide refrigeration and AC energy reduction plan. And they've been closely working with World Bank and went through the Partnership for Market Readiness PMR plan, which makes them a candidate to receive international support when it comes to energy reduction initiatives. For Iran, they can start by replicating the Energy Performance Certificate Scheme and also measuring, reporting, and verification systems, MRV, which are some of the basic fundamentals and building blocks for any future sustainability efforts. The next case is Singapore's smart city initiatives, and Singapore is a world-class example of smart cities. In the paper, I have a detailed introduction to various stages that Singapore has gone through to develop these smart city initiatives and all the steps required for energy systems, measurements, IoT, sensors, and execution. Iran is dealing with a lot of urban congestion, air pollution, heavy traffic, and by following through some of these inherent designs for city planning and also building designs can improve its energy use in buildings as well as reducing its urban emission levels. The last case study has to do with Malaysia and the role of national oil companies in leading the energy transition in developing economies. National oil companies in most of this region also play a significant role, but the national Iranian oil company in the past 10, 15 years have been facing a lot of challenges in terms of infrastructure, investment, technology, and developing talent. I have an example in the paper that looks into how efficient NIOC has been operating the past few years. In 2021, Iran flared, which means burnt natural gas or methane, 17.4 billion cubic meters of gas. To put this number in context, South Korea is the third largest importer of LNG. And the volume of gas that Iran is burning is close to 1/3 of South Korea's import. The same volume, if turned into electricity, can charge 20 million Tesla Model 3s for one full year. And so this is a huge waste of money and a ridiculously high source of emissions in the world. Petronas in Malaysia has been very successful. They've been the strongest oil and gas brand since 2020. A lot of it has to do with their sustainable efforts. And they're on the track to achieve zero emissions by 2050. They work closely with the zero routine flaring program within the World Bank. And they have plans to reduce their EPA definition of a scope 1 and 2 emissions by 50% and 70% in the next few years. They're actively looking for international JVs. So partnership with a company like Petronas is achievable. And like Rowan mentioned earlier today, there is a history of partnership between these two countries, which facilitates such future collaborations. So to conclude, in this paper, I introduce a few risks. Iran faces drastic domestic energy security risk in the near future, and also on a global scale is becoming a threat because of its very high GHG emissions. We also looked at some potentials which Iran can enhance its energy security by either replicating or collaborating with ASEAN countries in the 4 use cases discussed here. And ASEAN have a very practical collaborative energy framework that can empower and enable both sides if they work with each other. And then finally, I believe that this actually might introduce diplomacy conduit for international community to get back to Iran and invest in reducing Iran's climate risk and open a door for future improved policy between Iran and the rest of the world. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Ashayeri, for your enlightening presentation. So we reserved less than 10 minutes for Q&A, and I kindly ask our audience to be concise and to the point when posing questions. Please.
2 quick questions. What is the status of the Iranian-Chinese agreement to develop energy resources inside Iran, and how would that in any way, if you have any information about it, affect Iran coming on the brink of an energy disaster, as you pointedly said? And my question to the other panelists is the issue of the comparison of Iranian products and their knowledge intensity compared to Chinese products. If indeed Iran's knowledge intensity product distribution is higher, what other factors explain why Iran forgoes its own knowledge intensity processes in favor of importing Chinese knowledge intense products? I'm not an economist. I'm trying to, this is a layperson's language, so forgive me, but I've tried my best.
This has been a very fascinating panel. Thank you, all 3. My question is more methodological and directed at both our economists on the panel, Professor Karimi and Professor Eslamloueyan. Do I correctly pronounce your name? Eslamloueyan, yeah. The picture you have depicted is one of trade diversification. You have both attributed it to Iran's look east policy or sanctions. Maybe, arguably, both different sides of the same coin. But the question is that when you look at such data over a long period of time, the changes we see can be attributed to so many other factors. Climatic change, population growth, various types of crises, wars in the 1980s, for instance, and so on and so forth. I think in your model, you attribute and test the contribution of sanctions to the change in the pattern of trade. What I want to ask is, if, as you correctly said, this is part of a wider, more global pattern of trade diversification in favor of the East, from which other countries have also benefited, and in a way which reflects the pull factor coming from the East rather than Iran proactively looking to the East. How can we separate out, Iran's distinct position in this equation? Because, and this is really the value added from the economist's perspective on this panel to the political discussions over the last day and a half. It brings out, in my mind, also as a fellow economist, the ambiguity at two levels. One is East. What is the East? You correctly said that the UAE is Iran's gateway to trade with the West, okay? And the second one is to what extent we can, attribute a pattern of trade diversification which has affected other countries perhaps as much, if not more, than Iran, be it under sanctions or under non-sanctions. I think these are some methodological issues that will help clarify the impact of
Thank
the
you.
policy.
One last question. Yes, please.
منيرة الشمري طالبة ماجستير في الدراسات الأمنية النقدية. سؤالي موجه للدكتورة زهرة.
Master's student. My question is to Zahra Karimi.
هل العقوبات الموجهة لإيران
So these sanctions to Iran, have they contributed to Iran's move eastward? And is this going to contribute to the development of the Iranian economy? Thank you. حسناً شكراً.
Kindly ask our presenters to be concise and give short responses to the questions because we need to end the session. So each speaker have 2 minutes.
I can go ahead with the first question regarding China's role in developing Iran's energy infrastructure. So, this applies to both China and Russia and a lot of other foreign players that various rounds try to enter and signed MOUs and try to participate. Like CNPC, I think, was in a joint venture with French Total for South Pars field or the North Dome field. They pulled out. They had partnerships in oil fields southwestern of Iran, neighboring the Majnoon oil fields in Iraq. But those projects also didn't move forward as expected by NIOC. So these opportunities are lost. Iran gradually losing its global market share, its position in OPEC. So, and oil is not as important as it used to be in the past. So I think Iran can wait so much to attract investment or bring technology from China or Russia. And I think at some point, as a country, Iran has to make a decision to maybe revise its energy policy.
Thank you, Professor.
Regarding your question about the complexity index, see, the complexity index it shows the amount of knowledge used in production, distribution, and resource allocation. China's rank is 25, and Iran's rank is 67. It means the complexity index. It means that the knowledge base or human capital that is used in Chinese exports to the world is much higher than Iran. So this is why Iran cannot export to China based on complexity index. So with the complexity index, if Iran improves, it still cannot, not China to East, like Korea, Japan, China, India. It export to other countries, neighboring countries, as less developed countries. This is regarding your perspective. And next question.
I wanted to show that these sanctions really did not help Iran economic development. Perhaps some part of Iran economy could benefit from these sanctions. For example, clothing, something like this, or home appliances for short term, because great rivals are kept outside the country. But as inflation increased and production costs increased very rapidly, this short period is disappearing. And I wanted to show that looking east couldn't compensate the sanction, couldn't. It is important. A very quick answer to Dr. Keynush. Just after the sanction, Chinese companies also left Iran energy sector because big Chinese companies are afraid of US sanctions as well. So regarding technology transfer from China, it is not possible because big Chinese companies have very close ties with the West.
Thank you. I would like to thank again our speakers for their valuable contribution to our session, and I would like also to thank the audience, and we look forward to seeing you shortly for our next session. Thank you very much.